Sarah Chin adjusted her security uniform one last time before stepping through the employee entrance of Goldstone Corporate Plaza. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble lobby, and she could already see the steady stream of executives and office workers beginning their daily ritual of badge taps and hurried coffee runs. At 28, Sarah had been working security at the plaza for 3 years. It wasn't her dream job, but it paid the bills while she worked toward her criminal justice degree at night. The position had taught her to read people quickly, to spot trouble before it escalated, and to handle difficult situations with calm professionalism. Her supervisor, Mike Rodriguez, nodded as she approached the main security desk. "Morning, Sarah. Quiet night, but we've got the quarterly board meeting today. Expect heavy traffic around 9. Sarah settled into her position at the main entrance checkpoint. The metal detectors hummed quietly, and the X-ray machines were already warmed up and ready. She preferred the morning shift. People were generally more cooperative when they hadn't yet been worn down by their workday. The first wave of employees began trickling through around 7:30. Sarah knew most of them by sight now. There was Janet from accounting, who always forgot to remove her keys before walking through the detector. Tom from legal, who invariably set off the metal detector with his steel-toed boots but refused to wear anything else. The familiar faces made the job easier. Around 8:15, the pace picked up significantly. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, checking IDs, directing visitors to the sign-in desk, and maintaining the steady flow of people through security. She had developed a system over the years: a quick smile, efficient service, and firm but polite enforcement of the rules. "Good morning, Mr. Davidson," she said to one of the regular lawyers as he approached her checkpoint. "How was your weekend?" "Can't complain, Sarah." "Thanks for asking," he replied, holding up his badge for scanning. "Busy day ahead with the board meeting." Sarah nodded and waved him through. These small interactions were what she enjoyed most about the job. Despite what some people thought about security work, it wasn't just about checking bags and watching monitors. It was about being the first face people saw when they entered the building, setting the tone for their day. The morning rush was in full swing when Sarah noticed an unusual commotion near the executive parking garage entrance. A black sedan with military plates had pulled up to the curb, and a man in an army dress uniform was stepping out. Even from her position at the main checkpoint, Sarah could see the multiple stars on his shoulders indicating very high rank. General Marcus Thornfield was someone Sarah recognized from news coverage of military affairs. He was known for his decorated service record and his current position overseeing several defense contracts that Goldstone Corporation held. What she didn't know was his reputation for expecting special treatment and his tendency to become aggressive when he didn't receive it. The general strode through the main doors with the bearing of someone accustomed to having people jump to attention in his presence. His aide, a younger officer carrying a briefcase, followed 2 steps behind. Sarah could sense the shift in the lobby's atmosphere as other visitors and employees noticed the high-ranking military presence. General Thornfield approached Sarah's checkpoint without slowing his pace, clearly expecting to walk straight through without the standard security procedures. Sarah had dealt with VIPs before who assumed their status exempted them from building security protocols. Corporate policy was clear: everyone, regardless of rank or position, went through the same security screening. "Good morning, General," Sarah said with professional courtesy as he approached. "I'll need to see your identification and have you step through the metal detector, please?" The general stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at Sarah. At 6 feet 2 inches, he was accustomed to using his physical presence to intimidate, and he clearly expected this young security guard to back down immediately. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military command. "Yes, sir, I do," Sarah replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. However, building security policy requires all visitors to go through standard screening procedures. "It will just take a moment." The general's face began to redden. He was clearly not accustomed to being told what to do by someone he considered far beneath his station. "I'm here for an important meeting with the board of directors. I don't have time for this nonsense." Sarah had been in similar situations before, though rarely with someone of such high military rank. She knew that backing down would not only violate company policy but could also set a dangerous precedent. Security protocols existed for everyone's safety, and exceptions based on perceived importance could create serious vulnerabilities. "I understand you have an important meeting, General," Sarah said, maintaining her professional demeanor. "The screening process will only take 30 seconds, and then you'll be on your way." By now, other people in the lobby had begun to notice the confrontation. Some employees who recognized the general were watching nervously, unsure whether to intervene or continue about their business. Sarah's supervisor, Mike, was dealing with a separate issue at the visitor registration desk and hadn't yet noticed what was developing at the main checkpoint. The general took a step closer to Sarah's position, using his height and military bearing to try to intimidate her. "Young lady, I've been serving this country since before you were born. I've briefed presidents and commanded thousands of soldiers. I'm not going to be treated like a common criminal by some security guard." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but her training kicked in. She had learned early in her security career that showing fear or uncertainty in these situations would only make them worse. She needed to remain calm, professional, and firm in enforcing the established protocols. "Sir, I have great respect for your service," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "However, these security measures are in place to protect everyone in this building, including you. I need you to place your personal items in the tray and step through the metal detector." The general's aide shifted uncomfortably behind his superior, clearly aware that the situation was escalating beyond what was necessary. He had seen his commanding officer in similar situations before and knew that the general's temper could lead to problems if not managed carefully. "General," the aide said quietly, "perhaps we should just quiet, Lieutenant," the general snapped without turning around, keeping his glare fixed on Sarah. "I'm handling this." The lobby had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation. Some employees had stopped their conversations to watch, while others hurried past, trying to avoid getting involved. Sarah was acutely aware that she had become the center of attention, but she knew she couldn't let that pressure influence her decision. General Thornfield leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "Let me make this very simple for you. You can either let me pass right now, or you can explain to your supervisors why you caused an international incident by delaying a meeting that involves millions of dollars in defense contracts." Sarah had dealt with threats before, though rarely so specific or from someone with such apparent influence. She understood that her response in the next few moments would likely determine not just the outcome of this situation, but possibly her continued employment at Goldstone Plaza. The general continued, his voice growing more aggressive. "I could have you fired with a single phone call. Do you really want to risk your career over some ridiculous security theater?" At this point, Mike Rodriguez had finished dealing with the visitor registration issue and noticed the commotion at the main checkpoint. He began walking over, but Sarah knew she needed to handle this herself. Running to her supervisor for help would undermine her authority and potentially make the situation worse. "General Thornfield," Sarah said, using his name deliberately to establish that she wasn't intimidated by his rank, "threatening a security officer is a serious matter. I'm going to ask you one more time to comply with our standard security procedures. If you're unwilling to do so, I'll need to contact building management to resolve this situation." The general's face was now completely red, and Sarah could see a vein pulsing at his temple. She had clearly pushed him past his breaking point, and she braced herself for whatever would come next. "You insolent little," the general began, his voice rising loud enough that everyone in the lobby could now hear clearly. What happened next would change everything. The general, in his anger and frustration, made a decision that would have consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. His years of being deferred to and his expectation of special treatment had created a blind spot that was about to become a very public problem. Sarah stood her ground, her hand moving instinctively toward the radio on her belt. She had no idea that this moment would soon become national news, or that her actions in the next few minutes would earn her recognition far beyond the security industry. All she knew was that she had a job to do, and she intended to do it properly, regardless of who was standing in front of her. The tension in the lobby was now palpable. Employees and visitors alike had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Some had discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. General Thornfield raised his voice further, his military bearing now completely abandoned in favor of raw anger. "I've had enough of this nonsense. You're going to let me through right now, or I'm going to make sure you regret it for the rest of your career." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just this moment, but likely her entire future at Goldstone Plaza. She had been trained for situations like this, but the reality of facing down a general with decades of command experience was testing every bit of her resolve. The general moved closer to her checkpoint, clearly intending to push past her and enter the building without going through security. Sarah realized that she was about to face the ultimate test of her training, her principles, and her courage. Little did anyone in that lobby know that this confrontation was about to take a turn that would expose the general's true character and transform Sarah from an unknown security guard into a symbol of professional integrity and courage under pressure. The marble floor of Goldstone Plaza's lobby seemed to amplify every sound as General Thornfield took another aggressive step towards Sarah's checkpoint. His polished military shoes clicked against the stone with the sharp precision of someone accustomed to making intimidating entrances. But Sarah had seen enough bullies in her 3 years of security work to recognize the pattern, regardless of how many stars decorated their uniform. "General, I need you to step back from the checkpoint," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the now silent lobby. The usual morning chatter had completely stopped, and even the soft jazz that typically played through the building's sound system seemed inadequate to mask the tension that had settled over the space. Mike Rodriguez was now approaching rapidly, but he was still 30 feet away when General Thornfield made his fateful decision. Instead of stepping back, he moved forward aggressively, reaching out as if to push Sarah aside so he could walk through the metal detector without screaming. What the general didn't know was that Sarah had grown up in a household where her father, a retired police officer, had taught her never to let anyone intimidate her through physical presence. Her mother, a social worker who dealt with difficult clients daily, had instilled in her the importance of maintaining professional boundaries even under pressure. These lessons had shaped Sarah into someone who would stand her ground when she knew she was right. As the general's hand came toward her shoulder, clearly intending to physically move her aside, Sarah stepped back and spoke loudly and clearly, "Sir, do not touch me. Step away from the checkpoint immediately." The general's response was swift and completely inappropriate. "Don't you tell me what to do, you little..." He reached for her again, this time more aggressively, attempting to grab her arm and push her aside. Sarah had been trained for exactly this situation. When someone became physically aggressive at a security checkpoint, protocol was clear: document everything, call for backup, and de-escalate if possible while protecting yourself and others. But what made this situation unique wasn't just the general's rank, it was what he did next. Frustrated by Sarah's continued resistance and emboldened by what he perceived as his untouchable status, General Thornfield crossed a line that would prove to be his downfall. He grabbed Sarah's wrist forcefully, squeezing it as he tried to pull her away from the checkpoint entrance. "Move aside right now, or I'll have you court-martialed," he threatened, apparently forgetting that civilian security guards aren't subject to military justice. But then, he made an even more serious mistake. As Sarah tried to pull her wrist free from his grip, the general's other hand moved in a way that was completely inappropriate and absolutely inexcusable. In his anger and sense of entitlement, he committed an act of sexual harassment that several dozen witnesses in the lobby saw clearly. "What did you just do?" Sarah asked loudly, her voice cutting through the lobby like a knife. She stepped back, rubbing her wrist where the general had grabbed her, but, more importantly, she made sure everyone present understood what had just occurred. The general, realizing that his behavior had been witnessed by numerous people, tried to minimize what had happened. "I barely touched you. Don't be so dramatic." But Sarah wasn't about to let this slide. Her father had taught her that predators relied on their victims being too embarrassed or intimidated to speak up. Her criminal justice classes had covered sexual harassment extensively, and she knew that what had just happened was not only inappropriate but illegal. "You did more than touch my wrist, General," Sarah said, speaking clearly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "And there are at least 50 witnesses who saw exactly what you did." The general's aide, Lieutenant Morrison, looked mortified. He had served under General Thornfield for 2 years and had heard rumors about inappropriate behavior, but he had never witnessed it firsthand. Now, standing in a corporate lobby with dozens of people staring, he realized that his commanding officer had just created a scandal that could destroy both their careers. Mike Rodriguez finally reached the checkpoint, having heard enough of the conversation to understand that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple disagreement about security procedures. "Sarah, are you all right?" he asked, positioning himself between her and the general. "I'm fine, Mike, but we need to call building security and the police," Sarah replied. "This gentleman just committed sexual assault in front of multiple witnesses." The word assault sent a ripple through the crowd of onlookers. Several people pulled out their phones, and Sarah could hear the distinct sounds of video recording beginning. In the age of social media, she knew that what had just happened would likely be documented from multiple angles. General Thornfield, perhaps beginning to realize the gravity of his situation, attempted to use his military authority to control the narrative. "This is ridiculous. I'm a decorated general in the United States Army. I came here for an important meeting, and this security guard is making false accusations to cover up her own incompetence." But his words rang hollow to everyone who had witnessed the encounter. The lobby's security cameras had recorded everything, and there were too many witnesses for anyone to doubt what had actually occurred. Janet from accounting, who had been walking through the lobby when the confrontation began, stepped forward. "I saw exactly what happened," she said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "That man grabbed her inappropriately. Everyone saw it." Tom from legal, who had been returning from getting coffee when the situation escalated, nodded in agreement. "I'm an attorney, and what I just witnessed was clear sexual assault. This young woman was just doing her job." The general looked around the lobby, apparently beginning to understand that his usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work in this situation. The corporate environment was different from a military base where his rank could shield him from consequences. Here, he was just another visitor who had violated both company policy and criminal law. Sarah, meanwhile, was following her training. She spoke into her radio, calling for additional security and requesting that building management be notified immediately. She also asked Mike to contact the police, knowing that what had just occurred needed to be properly documented and investigated. "This is building security," she said into her radio, her voice professional despite what she had just experienced. "We have a situation at the main entrance checkpoint. I need additional units and management response immediately." The general's aide, Lieutenant Morrison, was now facing a career-defining decision. He could either support his commanding officer's version of events or tell the truth about what he had witnessed. His military training emphasized honor and integrity, but his career advancement depended on staying in the general's good graces. "Lieutenant," the general said sharply, "tell these people that nothing inappropriate happened here." Morrison looked at his commanding officer, then at Sarah, then at the dozens of witnesses surrounding them. He thought about his oath as an officer, his responsibilities to uphold military standards, and the young woman who had simply been doing her job when she was assaulted. "Sir," Lieutenant Morrison said quietly, "I can't do that. Everyone saw what happened." The general's face went from red to purple. Not only had a civilian security guard stood up to him, but now his own aide was refusing to support his version of events. His sense of entitlement, which had carried him through decades of military service, was crashing against the reality of civilian accountability. Building security arrived within minutes, followed closely by the Goldstone Plaza general manager, Patricia Wells. She was a no-nonsense executive who had dealt with difficult situations before, but never involving a high-ranking military officer and allegations of sexual assault. "What's the situation here?" she asked Mike Rodriguez, while taking in the scene, the angry general, the shaken security guard, and the crowd of witnesses. Mike quickly summarized what had occurred, while Sarah provided a clear, factual account of the general's behavior. Patricia Wells listened carefully, understanding immediately that this situation had the potential to become a public relations nightmare for the building and everyone involved. "General Thornfield," she said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the building immediately. Your meeting has been cancelled, and you are no longer welcome on this property." The general sputtered, "You can't ban me from this building. I have important business here." Do you know how much money the military contracts represent to this company? Patricia Wells had been in corporate management long enough to recognize a threat when she heard one. General, you just committed a crime on our property in front of dozens of witnesses. Your business relationships with our tenants are now the least of your concerns. The police arrived shortly afterward, having been called by both building security and several witnesses who had used their cell phones to report the incident. Officers Martinez and Johnson were experienced in handling complex situations, but even they were somewhat surprised to find themselves taking a report about a general in the U.S. Army. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said to Sarah, "we understand there was an incident here. Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Sarah provided a clear, detailed account of the entire confrontation, from the general's initial refusal to go through security screening to his physical and sexual assault. She spoke calmly and professionally, sticking to the facts and avoiding any editorializing about the general's behavior. Officer Johnson interviewed several witnesses, all of whom corroborated Sarah's account. The consistency of their stories, combined with the lobby's security footage, created a clear picture of what had occurred. General Thornfield, meanwhile, had called his own attorney and was attempting to control the damage to his reputation and career. But, in the age of smartphones and social media, that was proving to be an impossible task. Unknown to the general, several people in the lobby had been recording the confrontation on their phones. By the time the police finished taking statements, videos of the incident were already beginning to appear on social media platforms. The hashtag #SecurityGuardHero was starting to trend, and news organizations were beginning to pick up the story. The general's attempt to use his military rank to intimidate a security guard who was simply doing her job had backfired spectacularly. Instead of getting the special treatment he expected, he had created a scandal that would soon reach the highest levels of the Pentagon and potentially end his military career. As the police finished their investigation and prepared to escort the general from the building, Sarah realized that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. What had started as a routine morning at work had become a defining moment that would soon make her a symbol of courage and professionalism in the face of abusive power. Within 2 hours of the incident at Goldstone Plaza, the first cell phone video appeared on social media. The footage was shaky and didn't capture every detail, but it clearly showed General Thornfield grabbing Sarah and then committing the inappropriate act that had shocked everyone in the lobby. The person who posted it, a marketing executive who had been getting coffee, included a caption that read, "Decorated General thinks his rank means he can assault security guards." This brave woman stood her ground. Sarah was in the building's security office, giving her detailed statement to Detective Lisa Chang from the Metropolitan Police Department's Special Victims Unit. Chang had been called in because of the nature of the allegations and the high profile of the accused. She was known for her thorough investigations and her ability to handle sensitive cases involving public figures. "I want to make sure I have this exactly right," Detective Chang said, reviewing her notes. "The general initially refused to go through standard security screening?" "That's correct," Sarah replied. "He seemed to expect that his military rank would exempt him from our normal procedures. When I explained that everyone has to go through screening, he became increasingly aggressive." Sarah's supervisor, Mike Rodriguez, sat nearby providing additional context about building security policies and Sarah's exemplary record as an employee. He had already spoken with Patricia Wells, the building manager, who had made it clear that Goldstone Plaza would fully support Sarah and cooperate completely with the investigation. Meanwhile, in a conference room 3 floors above, an emergency meeting was taking place. Patricia Wells, the building's head of security, and legal counsel were discussing the implications of the morning's events. They knew that within hours, media attention would focus on their building, their security procedures, and their employee. "Our priority is supporting Sarah and making sure she has everything she needs," Patricia Wells said. "But we also need to prepare for the media storm that's coming. This story has all the elements that cable news loves: military rank, abuse of power, and a young woman standing up for herself." The legal counsel, David Kim, was already fielding calls from reporters who had picked up the story from social media. "The general's people are trying to get ahead of this. They're claiming it was a misunderstanding, that Sarah overreacted to normal physical contact. But their narrative was being undermined by the growing number of witnesses who were speaking publicly about what they had seen. Janet from accounting had already given an interview to a local news station, clearly stating that she had witnessed sexual assault. Tom from legal had posted a detailed account on his LinkedIn profile, describing the incident as a clear example of someone using their position to intimidate and assault a woman who was simply doing her job. The most damaging evidence, however, was coming from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Morrison, the general's aide, had spent the morning wrestling with his conscience and consulting with a military attorney about his obligations. By early afternoon, he had made a decision that would effectively end his commanding officer's career. Morrison contacted the Pentagon's Inspector General's office and provided a full account of not only the morning's incident but also other instances of inappropriate behavior he had witnessed during his time serving under General Thornfield. His report painted a picture of an officer who had used his rank to intimidate and harass subordinates for years, with the incident at Goldstone Plaza being merely the most public example of a long-standing pattern. The general has a history of inappropriate behavior toward women, Morrison told investigators. I've seen him make unwelcome advances toward female officers, civilian employees, and now the security guard. What happened this morning wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time he did it in front of enough witnesses that he couldn't deny it. Morrison's testimony was particularly damaging because military regulations require officers to report misconduct by their superiors. His admission that he had witnessed previous incidents but failed to report them was professionally embarrassing, but his decision to finally come forward provided investigators with crucial evidence of a pattern of behavior. Back at Goldstone Plaza, Sarah was beginning to understand the scope of what was happening. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, and building security had to escort her to her car to avoid the news vans that were already gathering outside. The story was spreading far beyond local news, with national media picking up on what they were calling Gategate, a reference to both the security gate where the incident occurred and political scandals ending in gate. Sarah's family was also dealing with the sudden attention. Her father, retired police officer James Chen, was proud of his daughter's professionalism but worried about the scrutiny she would face. Her mother, social worker Maria Chen, understood better than most the psychological impact that sexual assault could have, even when the victim handled it as courageously as Sarah had. "I'm proud of you for standing your ground," James told his daughter over the phone. "But this is going to get bigger before it's over. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah wasn't entirely sure she was prepared, but she knew she had done the right thing. "Dad, if I had let him intimidate me, what would that say to every other person who faces harassment from someone in power? I had to do my job, and I had to protect myself." The social media response was overwhelmingly supportive of Sarah. The hashtag #SecurityGuardHero was trending nationally, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of workplace harassment and praising Sarah's courage in standing up to someone so much more powerful than herself. Women's rights organizations were already reaching out to offer support, and legal experts were appearing on news shows to explain why Sarah's actions were textbook examples of how to handle workplace harassment. But General Thornfield wasn't going down without a fight. His attorney, a high-powered Washington lawyer named Richard Blackwood, was attempting to control the damage by questioning Sarah's motives and suggesting that she had overreacted to normal interaction. "My client is a decorated war hero who has served his country with honor for over 30 years, Blackwood told reporters. "This young woman has taken a simple misunderstanding and turned it into a media circus for her own benefit." However, Blackwood's strategy was immediately undermined by the release of the lobby's security footage. Patricia Wells, after consulting with legal counsel and law enforcement, decided to release edited portions of the video to counter the general's claims that nothing inappropriate had occurred. The security footage was devastating to the general's defense. It clearly showed him becoming increasingly aggressive with Sarah, grabbing her wrist, and then committing the inappropriate touching that constituted sexual assault. The video also captured his threats and his attempt to use his military rank to intimidate Sarah into compliance. "The footage speaks for itself," Detective Chang told reporters. "This was not a misunderstanding. This was a clear case of assault by someone who believed his position would protect him from consequences." The release of the security footage triggered a new wave of media coverage. Legal experts on television were unanimous in their assessment that the general's behavior clearly constituted criminal assault. Military analysts were discussing the potential impact on his career and the broader implications for military discipline and civilian relations. Perhaps most importantly, other women began coming forward with their own stories about General Thornfield. A former Pentagon staff member contacted investigators to report that the general had made unwelcome advances toward her during a briefing 2 years earlier. A civilian contractor described how the general had cornered her at a military conference and made inappropriate comments about her appearance. These additional allegations transformed the story from an isolated incident to a pattern of predatory behavior. The Pentagon, which had initially attempted to downplay the situation, was now facing a full-scale crisis involving one of its senior officers. General Thornfield's commanding officer, 4-star General Patricia Hayes, called an emergency press conference to address the situation. Hayes, one of the highest-ranking women in the military, had built her career on maintaining the highest standards of military professionalism and had zero tolerance for the behavior her subordinate had demonstrated. The United States Army holds all personnel to the highest standards of conduct, General Hayes said. The behavior alleged in this incident, if proven true, is completely inconsistent with military values and will be addressed with the full force of military justice. The investigation was moving quickly. In addition to the civilian criminal charges that would be filed by Metropolitan Police, the Pentagon announced that General Thornfield would face a military court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer and violation of military regulations regarding appropriate behavior toward civilians. Sarah, meanwhile, was trying to process everything that was happening. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from being an unknown security guard to a national figure in discussions about workplace harassment, abuse of power, and the importance of standing up for oneself regardless of the consequences. Her employer, Goldstone Plaza, had been incredibly supportive. Patricia Wells had personally assured Sarah that her job was secure and that the building management company would provide whatever legal or emotional support she needed. They had also implemented additional security measures to protect Sarah from unwanted media attention and potential retaliation. Sarah, Patricia Wells told her during a private meeting, "What you did this morning took incredible courage. You faced down someone who expected his rank to intimidate you, and you refused to be bullied. That's exactly the kind of employee we want representing our company." The story was now being covered by major newspapers, television networks, and online news sources across the country. Editorial writers were praising Sarah's professionalism and courage while condemning the general's abuse of power. The incident had become a symbol of larger issues about workplace harassment, military accountability, and the importance of treating all people with respect regardless of their position or rank. But, for Sarah, the most important thing was that she had stood up for herself and potentially prevented the general from treating other women the same way. As she prepared to face the media attention that would continue for weeks to come, she knew that her actions had sent a message that no one, regardless of rank or position, was above the law or basic human decency. The general, who had expected to intimidate a young security guard into backing down, had instead exposed himself as a predator and potentially ended his own career. His attempt to abuse his power had backfired completely, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. 3 weeks after the incident at Goldstone Plaza, the full scope of General Thornfield's misconduct was becoming clear. What had started as a single confrontation with a security guard had evolved into a comprehensive investigation involving multiple government agencies, dozens of witnesses, and a pattern of behavior spanning nearly a decade of military service. Sarah Chen had become reluctantly famous. Her face was recognizable to millions of Americans who had seen the security footage or read about her courage in standing up to a powerful military figure. She had received hundreds of letters and emails from people thanking her for her bravery, including many from women who shared their own stories of workplace harassment and intimidation. The legal proceedings were moving forward on multiple fronts. Detective Chang had completed her investigation and forwarded charges to the district attorney's office. General Thornfield would face criminal charges including assault, sexual assault, and making threats. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage, multiple witnesses, and the general's own aide testifying against him. But the military justice system was moving even faster. The Pentagon's investigation, led by the Inspector General's office, had uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that went far beyond the incident with Sarah. Lieutenant Morrison's testimony had opened the floodgates, and other military personnel were now coming forward with their own accounts of the general's inappropriate conduct. Captain Jessica Torres, a military intelligence officer, provided testimony about an incident that had occurred during a deployment in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. She described how General Thornfield had cornered her in a supply tent and made unwelcome advances, using his rank to intimidate her into silence when she tried to report the incident. "He told me that my career would be over if I said anything," Torres testified during the preliminary hearing. "He said that no one would believe a junior officer over a general, and that I would be transferred to the worst assignment he could find if I caused him any problems." Similar stories emerged from other female military personnel. A Navy lieutenant described harassment during a joint training exercise. A civilian contractor reported inappropriate comments and unwanted touching during a procurement meeting. An Army major detailed how the general had retaliated against her professionally after she rejected his advances. The pattern was consistent. General Thornfield used his position of authority to target women who were dependent on his goodwill for their careers. He had calculated that his victims would be too intimidated or too concerned about their professional futures to report his behavior. For years, this strategy had worked perfectly. What he hadn't counted on was encountering someone like Sarah Chen, who had no military career to protect, no reason to fear his retaliation, and enough courage to stand her ground even when faced with someone of his apparent authority. The military court-martial proceedings were being closely watched by both military personnel and civilian observers. General Patricia Hayes, who was overseeing the case, had made it clear that the Army would not tolerate this behavior regardless of the accused rank or service record. "Military leadership requires the highest standards of personal conduct," General Hayes said during a Pentagon press briefing. "When an officer violates those standards, especially in ways that harm others, they must be held accountable. There are no exceptions based on rank, service record, or personal connections." The evidence presented during the court-martial was devastating to General Thornfield's defense. In addition to the testimony from his victims, investigators had uncovered a pattern of transferred personnel and buried complaints that painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. Major Robert Kim, a military prosecutor, presented evidence showing that General Thornfield had used his influence to have several female officers transferred to undesirable assignments after they had rebuffed his advances or complained about his behavior. Email records showed him discussing these transfers with subordinate officers in ways that made clear they were retaliatory. The defendant didn't just harass and assault women under his command, Major Kim told the court-martial panel. He used the entire military personnel system as a weapon against anyone who refused to tolerate his behavior. This represents a fundamental corruption of military leadership and a betrayal of everyone who served under him. The defense team, led by military attorney Colonel Susan Walsh, attempted to argue that the general's behavior had been misunderstood and that his accusers were exaggerating isolated incidents for personal or professional gain. But this strategy collapsed under the weight of evidence and the consistency of testimony from multiple victims across different time periods and locations. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the testimony of General Thornfield's own staff officers. Lieutenant Morrison had provided the initial breakthrough, but other officers who had served under the general also came forward to describe a command climate where harassment and intimidation were routine. Colonel David Martinez, who had served as the general's chief of staff for 3 years, testified about the general's practice of making inappropriate comments about female personnel during staff meetings. He would regularly comment on women's appearance in ways that were unprofessional and made everyone uncomfortable, Martinez said. "When I tried to address it with him privately, he told me I needed to develop a sense of humor." The testimony revealed that General Thornfield had created a toxic command environment where his inappropriate behavior was an open secret, but where subordinate officers felt powerless to challenge him due to his rank and influence. This culture of intimidation had allowed his predatory behavior to continue unchecked for years. Meanwhile, the civilian criminal case was also proceeding. Sarah had testified before a grand jury, which had returned indictments on all charges recommended by the prosecutor. The district attorney, Karen Rodriguez, had decided to personally handle the case due to its high profile and the importance of the issues it raised. This case is about more than one incident, Rodriguez told reporters. It's about whether we as a society will tolerate powerful people using their positions to intimidate and assault others. The defendant's military rank makes his behavior more serious, not less serious, because he was supposed to be an example of honor and integrity. The public support for Sarah had been overwhelming, but she was also facing some criticism from people who believed she should have shown more deference to the general's military service. Some right-wing commentators had suggested that she was being used by liberal activists to attack the military, while others questioned whether her response to the general's behavior had been proportionate. These criticisms bothered Sarah, but they were vastly outnumbered by expressions of support from across the political spectrum. Military veterans organizations had issued statements praising her for helping to expose behavior that damaged the reputation of the armed forces. Women's rights groups had held her up as an example of courage in the face of harassment. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah had received dozens of messages from other security guards, police officers, and service industry workers who described similar experiences with powerful people who expected special treatment or felt entitled to abuse their authority. "Thank you for showing that we don't have to accept this kind of treatment," wrote one hotel security guard from Chicago. "I had a similar experience with a politician who thought his office gave him the right to treat me however he wanted. Seeing you stand up for yourself gave me the courage to report it." Sarah's employer, Goldstone Plaza, had been exemplary in their support throughout the ordeal. Patricia Wells had ensured that Sarah had access to counseling services, legal support, and time off when needed to deal with the legal proceedings and media attention. The building management company had also implemented new training programs for security staff on handling harassment and assault situations. "Sarah represented the best of what we want in our employees," Patricia Wells said during a company-wide meeting. "She showed professionalism, courage, and integrity under extremely difficult circumstances. We're proud to have her on our team, and will continue to support her throughout this process." The case had also prompted broader discussions about security procedures and how to handle situations involving high-ranking officials or VIPs. Law enforcement agencies and private security companies were reviewing their training programs to ensure that their personnel were prepared to handle similar situations professionally and safely. As the court-martial proceedings continued, it became clear that General Thornfield's military career was effectively over. Even if he somehow avoided conviction on the most serious charges, the pattern of behavior that had been revealed made it impossible for him to continue in a leadership position. The Army had already begun the process of removing him from his command and was considering options for his retirement or dismissal from service. The general's wife, Margaret Thornfield, had filed for divorce and issued a public statement expressing her support for his victims. "I had no knowledge of my husband's behavior, but I believe these women and I support their courage in coming forward," she said. "No one should have to endure harassment or assault, especially from someone in a position of trust and authority." The Pentagon had also announced a comprehensive review of policies and procedures for handling harassment complaints within the military. The Thornfield case had exposed significant gaps in the system that had allowed a predatory officer to continue his behavior for years without meaningful consequences. Secretary of Defense Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, announced the formation of a special task force to review military justice procedures and recommend reforms to ensure that harassment and assault cases were handled more effectively in the future. "The men and women who serve our country deserve to work in an environment free from harassment and intimidation," Secretary Chen said. "We will not tolerate behavior that undermines military readiness, unit cohesion, or basic human dignity." For Sarah, the most satisfying aspect of the entire ordeal was knowing that her actions had potentially protected other women from becoming victims of General Thornfield's predatory behavior. The investigation had revealed that he had been escalating his conduct over time, and several experts testified that he likely would have continued to target women if not for the public exposure that resulted from the Goldstone Plaza incident. As she prepared for the continuation of both the court-martial and criminal proceedings, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she simply tried to do her job professionally. She had become an unwilling symbol of courage and resistance to abuse of power, but she had also helped to expose a serious problem within military leadership and potentially prevented other women from suffering similar treatment. The general who had expected to intimidate a young security guard into submission had instead triggered his own downfall and sparked a national conversation about accountability and respect that would continue long after his legal troubles were resolved. 6 months after the confrontation at Goldstone Plaza, both the military court-martial and civilian criminal cases had reached their conclusions. The results were decisive and sent a clear message that abuse of power would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or position. The military court-martial had concluded first. After 3 weeks of testimony from dozens of witnesses, the panel of senior officers deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding General Thornfield guilty on all charges: conduct unbecoming an officer, assault, sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and violation of military regulations regarding appropriate behavior toward civilians and subordinates. The presiding judge, General Robert Hayes, delivered a scathing assessment of the defendant's conduct during sentencing. "You have violated every principle of military leadership and brought disgrace upon the uniform you wore for 32 years, he said. Your behavior represents a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in you by your subordinates, your superiors, and the American people." General Thornfield was sentenced to dismissal from service, the military equivalent of dishonorable discharge for officers, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 18 months. More significantly, he would lose his military pension and all veterans' benefits, representing a financial loss of nearly $2 million over his expected lifetime. The civilian criminal case had taken longer due to the complexity of coordinating with the military proceedings, but the outcome was equally decisive. A jury of 12 citizens deliberated for 4 hours before finding the former general guilty of assault, sexual assault, and making criminal threats. Judge Maria Santos sentenced him to 3 years in prison, with the sentences to run concurrently with his military confinement. She also ordered him to pay restitution to Sarah for her legal expenses and counseling costs, and to perform community service focused on educating others about harassment and assault prevention. Mr. Thornfield, Judge Santos said, using his civilian title rather than his former military rank, you used your position of authority to intimidate and assault a young woman who was simply doing her job. Your behavior was predatory, calculated, and completely inexcusable. The sentence of this court reflects the seriousness of your crimes and sends a message that no one is above the law. Sarah was present for both sentencing hearings, accompanied by her parents and her attorney. She had chosen not to make victim impact statements in either proceeding, preferring to let her testimony during the trial speak for itself. However, she did issue a public statement after the civilian sentencing. Today's verdict shows that our justice system works when people have the courage to stand up for what's right, Sarah said outside the courthouse. I hope this case encourages other victims of harassment and assault to come forward and seek justice. No one should have to tolerate abuse from someone in a position of power. The impact of the Thornfield case extended far beyond the courtroom. The Pentagon had implemented significant reforms to its harassment reporting and investigation procedures, including the creation of an independent office to handle complaints against senior officers. The changes were designed to prevent the kind of systematic cover-up and retaliation that had allowed Thornfield's behavior to continue for years. Several other military officers had been disciplined for their failure to report or properly investigate previous complaints about Thornfield. Lieutenant Morrison, despite his eventual cooperation with investigators, received a letter of reprimand for his initial failure to report the general's misconduct, though his military career was allowed to continue. The case had also prompted changes in private security training and procedures. The International Association for Healthcare Security and Safety and other professional organizations had developed new training modules specifically focused on handling harassment and assault by high-profile individuals or authority figures. Goldstone Plaza had become something of a model for how employers should support employees who face harassment or assault in the workplace. Patricia Wells had been invited to speak at numerous conferences about crisis management and employee support, and the building's security procedures had been studied and adopted by other corporate facilities. For Sarah personally, the experience had been transformative. While she had never sought public attention, she had used her platform to advocate for other victims of workplace harassment and to promote better training and support systems for security personnel and service workers. She had returned to her position at Goldstone Plaza, where she was now the head of security training and employee safety programs. Her responsibilities included developing protocols for handling difficult situations and training other security staff on professional response to harassment and intimidation attempts. Sarah's experience taught all of us important lessons about standing up for our principles and supporting each other, Patricia Wells said during Sarah's promotion ceremony. She showed incredible courage under pressure, and now she's helping to ensure that other employees have the tools and support they need if they face similar situations. Sarah had also become a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, military leadership seminars, and women's rights events. Her message was consistent: everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their position, and no one should have to tolerate harassment or assault from someone in authority. "I was just doing my job that morning," Sarah would tell audiences. "I never expected to become a symbol of anything. But if my experience helps one other person find the courage to stand up for themselves, then everything we went through was worthwhile." The broader impact of the case on military culture was still being felt. The Army had conducted a comprehensive review of command climate at installations worldwide, identifying and addressing other situations where toxic leadership had created environments where harassment could flourish unchecked. Several other senior officers had been removed from command positions as a result of the review, though none involved misconduct as severe as Thornfield's. The military leadership recognized that the case had revealed systematic problems that required systematic solutions. "The Thornfield case was a wake-up call for our entire institution," said General Patricia Hayes, who had overseen the court-martial proceedings and now headed the Pentagon's new Office of Military Justice Reform. "We had to acknowledge that our systems for preventing and addressing harassment had failed, and that failure had real consequences for real people." The case had also had political ramifications. Congress had held hearings on military justice reform and had passed legislation strengthening protections for victims of harassment and assault within the armed forces. The new laws included provisions for independent investigation of complaints against senior officers and enhanced protections against retaliation. Lieutenant Morrison, despite the reprimand in his file, had emerged as an advocate for ethical leadership within the military. He had spoken publicly about the difficulty of reporting misconduct by superior officers and the importance of creating systems that encouraged such reporting. "I failed in my duty when I didn't report the general's earlier misconduct," Morrison said during testimony before a congressional committee. "But the system also failed by making it so difficult and professionally dangerous to report a superior officer. We need to change both the culture and the structures to ensure that this never happens again." The victims who had come forward during the investigation had also seen positive outcomes. Captain Jessica Torres had been promoted and was now serving in a prestigious assignment at the Pentagon, working on military justice reform initiatives. The civilian contractor who had reported harassment had received a commendation from the Secretary of Defense for her courage in coming forward. Perhaps most importantly, the case had sparked a broader cultural conversation about power, accountability, and respect in the workplace. The hashtag Security Guard Hero had evolved into a broader movement encouraging workers in all industries to report harassment and assault, with specific focus on situations involving power imbalances. Women's rights organizations had used the case to push for stronger harassment prevention training in workplaces across the country. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had cited the Thornfield case in new guidance documents about preventing and responding to workplace harassment. The security industry, in particular, had embraced Sarah as a symbol of professionalism and courage. She had received awards from multiple professional organizations and had been featured in security trade publications as an example of how proper training and personal courage could combine to handle even the most difficult situations. As Sarah reflected on the year that had passed since that confrontational morning at the security checkpoint, she was amazed by how much had changed. She had never wanted to be a public figure, but she had used the attention to advocate for important causes and to help create positive changes in military culture, workplace safety, and harassment prevention. The former General Thornfield was serving his sentence in a federal prison, his military career and reputation completely destroyed by his own actions. The man who had expected a young security guard to be intimidated by his rank and authority had instead learned that character and integrity matter more than titles or positions. Sarah's actions on that morning had sent a powerful message that resonated far beyond the marble lobby of Goldstone Plaza. No one, regardless of rank, position, or perceived authority, has the right to harass, intimidate, or assault another person. When people stand up for what's right, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming power, justice can prevail. The security checkpoint at Goldstone Plaza had returned to its normal routine, with Sarah and her colleagues efficiently processing the daily flow of employees and visitors. But the lessons learned from that confrontation continued to influence military policy, workplace safety procedures, and the ongoing fight against harassment and abuse of power. General Thornfield's attempt to intimidate one security guard had ultimately exposed his own predatory behavior and sparked reforms that would protect countless others from similar treatment. His fall from grace served as a reminder that true leadership requires character and integrity, and that those who abuse their authority will eventually face the consequences of their actions. For Sarah Chen, the young security guard who had simply tried to do her job professionally on what seemed like an ordinary morning, the experience had transformed her life and career. But, more importantly, her courage and professionalism had helped create a safer, more respectful environment for workers everywhere who might face similar challenges from those who believe their position places them above the rules that govern everyone else. The message was clear and lasting: harassment and abuse of power will not be tolerated, justice will prevail, and ordinary people with extraordinary courage can change the world.